Otis Alexander and Marie Collins that will be sharing about MITRE attacks for ICS. And a quick reminder that, again, feel free to put in questions in both the chat or the question section on GoToWebinar. And also, talks are being recorded, so you can catch these later. You won't miss out on anything on tracks 1 or the demos on track 3. So with that, Otis, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we've got you great. I'm going to turn it over to y'all. And then at the end, if you would like to, we'll rejoin and catch any questions from the audience if time permits.
Okay. And you can see my slides, right?
Oh, yes, you're good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So my name is Otis Alexander. I work for the MITRE Corporation as a principal cybersecurity engineer. I focus mainly on ICS security. I'm also lead the development of Attack for ICS, and that's what I'll be talking to you all about today. So I'll talk a little bit about what Attack for ICS is and how we use it in testbed environments. So Attack for ICS was released in January, and what we were looking at in terms of releasing it is for it to fill a gap in terms of understanding the tactics and techniques of adversaries who attack industrial control systems. So we wanted to use the attack a structure to represent these adversaries and what they do against these systems. And really highlight the impacts of these types of attacks. So since release, we've gotten a lot of attention from asset owners, operators, security vendors, integrators, and device vendors. And we really feel like these entities are crucial to ICS security. So we want to continue to build these relationships with these entities. Not only to mature our relationship with them, but to mature the state of ICS security and the state of Attack for ICS. So for those who aren't familiar with Attack, I'll go over a quick intro. Attack for Enterprise or ICS is basically a knowledge base of adversary behavior. And really what it is based on real world observations of what adversaries do against certain technology domains. So we're not thinking about everything you could potentially do to a system. We want to really highlight what has happened in the real world or what are red teams doing that are credible. It's free and it's open and it's globally accessible, so you can access Attack for ICS or Attack if you go to attack.mitre.org. It represents a common language that could be used to speak between red teams and defenders to more business-oriented people, but it really provides this common lexicon so we can understand adversary behavior. It's also community driven, so we are not just doing this in the silo at MITRE. We really rely on contributions from the community and feedback from the community. So this is the technique matrix. Specifically, this is the technique matrix for Attack for ICS. Across the top, you have tactics, which are the adversary's technical goals. So as you can see, this ranges from initial access all the way to impact on the Attack for ICS technique matrix. And then associated with these tactics, you have techniques or how the adversary achieves their goals. And then if you look at each specific technique, you'll get specific technique implementation. So this is how an adversary has accomplished this technique in the wild. So this is very important to get details about how this technique was executed. So altogether, this represents TTP, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. So there's a number of technology domains and knowledge bases represented in attack. Why do we need one for ICS? We can look at it from a number of different ways. We could look at it from the adversary standpoint and how they're different, and we could also look at technology. So from the adversary standpoint, there's different decisions to be made when you're looking at ICS, which kind of affects everything that you do. So if we want to create a physical impact, we're going to target certain systems and try to cause specific effects to get that physical impact. Also, the technologies are different. So how adversaries interact with those specific technologies, for instance, how they interact with an enterprise system versus an embedded device, is different. And then from the defender standpoint, there's different ways of defending these systems. So some things that we have to really keep in mind are data collection. How do we get data from these low-level devices, from the particular ICS protocols? That's a consideration that we really have to think about. And then also mitigations. We don't want to just recommend the run-of-the-mill standard IT mitigations for this area. We really have to think about the trade-offs of putting certain security controls in these environments and how it'll affect the ultimate goals of industrial control systems. So there's a lot to think about here, and that really forms the basis for why we created a new knowledge base. So this is the Purdue model. We look at it as a functional reference architecture. So each level in here kind of talks about a particular function of an industrial control system at large. When we look at incident reports or incidents in the wild, what we do is we first use enterprise attack to think about how the adversary affected the platforms that are addressed by enterprise attacks. So Windows, Linux, Macs platforms. How did the adversary leverage these platforms in order to get to a certain position in this system? Then to kind of complement or to fill the gap, we have Attack for ICS, which enumerates techniques that the adversary uses to manipulate engineering and maintenance functions, or basic process control, or protection and safety functions in the system. So it's really important to use these two together, as a lot of the attacks leverage traditional platforms getting up to the place where they can actually affect the control system. So this is the technique matrix again for attack for ICS. I'll just kind of break it up into some high-level chunks so that we can think about what the adversary's overall goals are in terms of using some of these tactics and techniques. So from initial access to command and control, we could kind of think about the adversary as trying to find their target, trying to collect information that's necessary to kind of affect the industrial control system, and just ultimately staging their attack. Then we have inhibit response function and impair process control, which represent two new tactic areas for attack. These are really talking about how the adversary directly affects the control system. So inhibit response function is really how do we prevent operators from being able to respond to a particular event, or how do we take out protection or safety functions to allow for our attack to have the greatest impact. And impair process control is really the adversary working against the basic process control system to drive the process into a bad state or create some impact that they're trying to create. And impact is, exactly what the adversary is seeking to create. This could be damage to property. It could be a loss of control or a loss of availability, or any of these techniques in this category. but it really is the end stage for most of these attacks, and they mostly have physical impacts. So like I said in the beginning, attack is based on pretty much real world information, real world attacks that have happened in the wild. Um, for ICS, there's only so many attacks that we have documented and open to the public. So we really have to figure out how we can augment this information so that we can get a better understanding of what potentially can happen. So that's where we get into failure and attack scenarios. So failure scenarios include malicious and non-malicious cyber events, such as compromising equipment functionality, things that can happen in terms of human error when they're operators or somebody's working with a system, data integrity attacks, anything like that. And these things don't have to be part of actual cyber attack. We can learn from mistakes that happen in the system or accidents. So this is very useful for a lot of different activities. The one I'll be talking about the most is security testing in testbed environments, but we could also use this to kick off a tabletop exercise with the asset owner operator to see how they will react to some of these situations. So we can generate these on our own, but there are also sources of data that we can look to. So there's subject matter experts in the area, operators, researchers, engineers that can all tell you how some of these systems fail and what are the things that lead up to those failures. There's also incident repositories such as the NTSB or PHMSA, so transportation incidents or pipeline incidents that are documented that we can leverage. There's also scenario repositories. So a big one that we've used a lot are the EPRI nest core failure scenarios, which are scenarios that are written out based on the electric power vertical. And you have a number of researchers and operators and different people who have come together to kind of put together these failure scenarios for us to leverage. So this is an example of some failure scenarios for electric power, specifically a substation environment, and these were generated by power engineers. So I'll quickly go over a couple of these just so you can get an idea of what I would be talking about in terms of a failure scenario. So scenario one is a transformer is being overloaded. So the objective here for the attacker is that they want to rapidly deteriorate the transformer installation. The techniques to use would be a modification of trip settings, of overcurrent and thermal protection relays, some type of attack that helps to block communications because you wouldn't want alarms to go up while you're trying to conduct your attack. You would also need to open the breakers to force power through one transformer so it bears all the load. And this would cause the transformer to rapidly heat up and degrade its insulation. Scenario two deals with disrupting switching execution for circuit breakers and isolators. So here we're trying to cause dielectric breakdown of breakers and isolators. And we do this by continually executing switching actions against a piece of equipment. And again, we have to kind of block communications up so that alarms don't reach an operator. And then scenario three is your run-of-the-mill Ukraine attack, where you're trying to cause a particular outage. So here the objective is to cause an entire substation outage and whatever contingencies come with that. And we can do that by opening one or more breakers. So let's look a little bit more closely at scenario one. So here, what we can do now is we can break out that information to get the full understanding of what we need to do as an attacker to accomplish this particular scenario. which is transformer overloading. So we can start at the top with the consequence, because we know that we want to cause thermal breakdown of transformer installation, and we want to make sure that operators or anybody else who's going to respond is unable to react to that critical situation. So starting on the left, we want to cause a no trip situation on the breaker of choice, and we do this by improper overcurrent or thermal settings. And then if we want to think about the attack technique that we need to use for that, we can modify a parameter. So we can modify that parameter to be too wide or too narrow so that it doesn't trip when it's supposed to. Then we can use an unauthorized command message to open a breaker so that we make sure that the transformer that we're targeting bears all the load. And then to cause a loss of view into the substation, we can manipulate communications by blocking reporting messages. These are messages that hold state information that's being pulled periodically, and we could suppress alarms. So when we look at it like this, we've combined a failure from subject matter experts who are power engineers, so we know that this has some realism to it. We thought about the failure mode, the cause, and we've connected that up to an attack technique. So now we have the full picture of how we can try to accomplish these consequences in a real environment. So to continue to build on this attack scenario, to build out the rest of the techniques that are used, we kind of have to ask ourselves some more questions. So we know what we're trying to accomplish. What's next? What's our entry point? How do we get into the substation or communicate to the substation? So it may be that we have to compromise the engineering workstation. It may be that we need to utilize an external remote service like a VPN directly into the substation, or some combination of techniques and initial access. So how do we find our targets? That's what discovery is for. We may have to do network sniffing. We may have to actively try to identify control devices with different clues on the network, or we may have to do some service scanning. And then we have to think about how we sustain our attack. We don't want somebody to interrupt or step in to stop what we're doing. So we need to block reporting messages, as I said before, and then suppress alarms. And then to cause the ultimate failure, we talked about impairing process control, which is modification of very important parameters that control breaker actions, and then also unauthorized command messages that control breaker actions as well. So we have to think about this whole scope of what we want to do in the testbed environment to get this particular effect. So this is a first pass at some of the techniques that would be needed. Some of these techniques could be viewed as core techniques to this particular scenario. And then we may have options that we can pick from depending on the particular architecture that we're targeting to accomplish some of these specific techniques. So another thing that's very important to think about is that these techniques are not just titles. So unauthorized command message has a lot of description behind it about what it actually means in terms of ICS protocols, how it's been used in the past. So there's at least 5 different instances of unauthorized command messages being used across various communication mediums right here in this particular description. So you have radio, you have traditional Ethernet communications, and you also have serial communications, which have been used. So this is all very important to research and think about when you're thinking about which particular command or which particular technique you want to execute. If you want to get even deeper into some of these techniques, and you could leverage the references that we've included with each technique on the technique pages to kind of do a deep dive into how these techniques were used in the wild against real systems. So another thing that we have to consider when we're in the testbed environment and we're using these techniques against the systems there is what data sources or artifacts are we leaving behind. So I think this is really important to understand both from the attacker standpoint and the defender standpoint. And a lot of solutions out there, and I think a lot of the attention focuses on network traffic, which is good because that is easy to collect and it has a lot of relevant information in it. But we have to also remember that your traffic, your network traffic is only as good as what you capture, and you can't be everywhere. So there have to remember that there's other sources of data in these networks, which includes host-based logs housed on embedded OT devices such as controllers, and also asset management data that can give you valuable clues about how a particular piece of equipment is acting at any point in time. So for this particular scenario that we looked at, the transformer overloading, we have a number of different data sources that we could look at that kind of give clues to our activities in the testbed environment, or if it was to happen in the real world, you know, what the attacker has really done. So what we've done is we've looked at a number of different controllers from a number of different vendors to get a high level understanding of the offerings or the collective data model for all these types of equipment. And we came up with these high level categories, which include configuration, performance and statistics, process information, asset management, and physical data sources that you can leverage to better understand what's going on in these environments. So for instance, we could always pull the parameters that have been assigned to a controller off the controller. We could also understand when these change if particular controllers log these events. Also, alarms and faults are usually recorded somewhere. So if we are looking at those, we can get a good idea of when some of these activities have occurred. So there's a lot more data in these environments than just the network based data sources. And we would encourage you to understand what's available on the host as well. So some considerations when you're looking at these data sources are, is there a documented standard mechanism for accessing this data source, or is it something that I'm going to have to write my own collector for? What's the storage size of the data source? And that's important because it may roll over on itself, especially for low-level embedded devices that may not have that much storage capacity. Is there a lot of noise in the data source? You know, if there's a configuration change made, is it just going to get lost in all the other events that are created? Is there a way to delete the data source? So from the adversary's perspective, you may want to delete everything out of that data source to make sure that your tracks are covered. Or from a defender's perspective, you may want to periodically collect this in case it is deleted. And then is it replicated? So is there some other entity in the network that's periodically pulling data from low-level devices or other places in the network and storing them centrally? So another look at this process, because I think it's very important, especially for individuals who are working in testbed environments to better understand adversary behavior and how to defend these environments. First thing that we want to do is understand failures associated with your target system. This is really important because this is tied to the overall goals of most attackers in this area. So we want to build an attack scenario around that chosen failure scenario. and build a story by researching how and why adversaries have caused similar failures in the past. When you conduct an attack, you want to try to induce your desired failures, and you want to understand what data sources were generated by your activity. And if you're purple teaming or working closely with blue teamers, you want to talk through these activities from the very start. There's no harm in telling the defender this is what we plan to do, and seeing what they are able to detect and what they're not able to detect. And you can work in an iterative fashion to improve both teams. So some key takeaways. It can be very helpful to build a full story around your test bed activities. It's nice to just go in without a plan and play around, but it's also very good to kind of structure your activities and document what you're trying to do and trying to accomplish. Attack for ICS can be a very valuable tool to structure these activities, and it provides a lot of insight about what has happened in the past in terms of industrial control system attacks. Another thing that's important is to understand the artifacts that are left behind, and this is the data source conversation that we had. So understand all the data sources that are available in your network. Some may be hard to collect or find, but it's good to know that they're there, even if it's just from a forensic standpoint. And then work closely with your defenders. It's good to learn from each other. It's good to talk to each other and have a common language so that you can structure your activities in the test bed. So on the horizon for attack for ICS, some things that you can look forward to are technique updates, mitigations for each technique. I think this is very important. So we're considering multiple stakeholders here, not just what asset owners and operators can do to defend their systems or prevent some of these techniques from being executed because they only have so much power, but also what can device vendors do, you know, from the start when they're building these pieces of equipment. What can integrators do when they're building these environments, and what can security firms do in terms of recommendations to asset owners and operators, or actions that they can perform to help prevent some of these attacks from happening. So we'll have a lot of references to security controls from international standards bodies. And we'll really focus on adversary use of the technique and how you can prevent that. And then we'll take in consideration interface functionality. So what would you do against management interface of a low-level device versus the operational communication interface? Another thing to look out for is a sticks representation of attack for ICS. This should make it a lot easier for people to ingest these tactics, techniques, mitigations, and all into their own tooling. And another thing that we're excited about is integration with Attack Navigator, because this will help to better visualize the technique matrix and highlight your attacks that you wish to create or things that adversaries have done in the past. So that's all I have. Please make sure to visit Attack for ICS at attack.miter.org/ICS. The link below is to contribute. Like I said, we rely on contributions and feedback from you. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Otis. And one of the questions we'd had in the app was confirming where to find the latest and greatest. So the website, it sounds like, is the best link to go find the latest attack matrix.
Correct. Yes, this website right here, attack.miter.org/ICS.
Excellent. And one last question, are 900 megahertz radio networks deployed in the distribution grid a reason for concern as an attack vector?
So in initial access, we have a technique called wireless compromise, and we document a couple of real world instances where radio or other wireless technologies are compromised as initial access vectors to, basically disrupt operations. So I think any wireless technology used for these environments represents a entry point for adversaries. So you should make sure that you secure them properly.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, Otis, for sharing the latest work that y'all have been tackling over at MITRE.